Thank you for joining us today. It feels like summertime here in the Atlanta area. We've got our air conditioner on. I had it on at home last night. 86 degrees expected to be in Atlanta. Straight from winter to summer. No springtime. This is the Georgia Independent School Association webinar. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series. My name is Bill Baker at Firestorm, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this webinar today. We invite you to become our friend at Facebook. Firestorm Solutions is our Facebook account. You can follow us on Twitter at FirestormSoul. Yes, we do have a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind, though, that the conversation today is not complete without the accompanying comments. Jim, we need to advance a slide. There we go. Okay.
A little slow today.
Okay. The work product provided must be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret the contents of the webinar as legal advice or legal opinion. We're pleased to have the Georgia Independent School Association as our host and co-sponsor of this Crisis Coach webinar series. This is the fourth in the 2015 series. I was looking at that 3 that's in there incorrectly.
Typos are exciting.
Right. It will never happen here. Conducting a self-assessment is our topic. Our presenter today is the president of Firestorm, Jim Satterfield. He's also the co-founder and a co-author of the book, Disaster Ready People for Disaster Ready America. Jim, over to you, please.
Well, we'd like to thank the Georgia Independent School Association for underwriting this webinar series and sharing the information today. Normally Jeff would be with us, but he's out working for the association as usual this morning and pulling the world together. So thank you again, and I would encourage you all to attend the meetings as they're coming up, and I know there's some new events that are in the pipeline. The question that we ask ourselves at school is, can we identify our next crisis? And as you think about the team that you've assembled to look at what the exposures are that you face in your school, have you identified what your school's next crisis will be? And that's extremely important, and that's the challenge. If we were a business today, we'd be talking with internal audit, and they'd be looking at how is the company structured and what's to be done and dealt with it. But it's equally as important and significantly more important because of the support that we give to children every single day in our schools to think in this direction. So if you think about this role of internal audit and apply it over to a school, the questions that parents ask are, is my child safe? Are you sure? And how do you know? So I want you to now put on a new hat and think about your school, and that new hat says internal auditor at the top of it. And think about the board of directors or the board of trustees that you have for your school, and the senior leadership, the head of school or the principal that you have within your organization. And how do we give them the assurance that our school is prepared and our school is ready? We need to then look specifically at our risk management processes. Have we identified all the risks that are out there? How do we have clear if those are starting to emerge, that they're reported? Do we have review processes to control those risks? What system of internal controls do we have to make sure that all of this is coming together? And then looking at the monitoring. You've heard us talk a lot about the intelligence network and what we need to have in place in dealing with each of those areas. So what are you monitoring? And by the way, of all the failures in a disaster or crisis, the failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks is the 3rd highest probability failure that you'll find within your organization and in your school. So why should we measure? There are a lot of questions that start to come up for us to focus on today. And as we focus on those, I'd like you to think about asking them about your school. Look around where you are today, evaluate that, and be prepared to answer these types of questions, because this is how we start to build the knowledge that you have with what's going on. Could your school survive a disruption or a crisis? What happens if a tornado hits one of your buildings? What happens if a significant event, in fact, occurs? Where do you stand today in terms of your plans? What do you need to improve on? You've been at your school for a while. You've worked in this area. You know some things that you would like to do better. What are those things? What do you think you have to have in place? How much progress are you making in moving ahead on each one of those? And I brought up the concept of the board earlier. There's a governance fiduciary responsibility that goes back to the board of directors for your school. And they've got a responsibility to see that those plans are in place by the school leadership. Now, the other reason that we'd want to start to measure this is to see if our plans align with best practices. Do you know what the best practices are? We've recently been engaged by a school that's had, unfortunately, a shooting that occurred. It occurred a couple of years ago, and the questions that are being raised now is, did you have all the plans in place at that point in time? Did those plans align to standards and best practices? And then did you follow them? Now, if you think about that, those are key critical questions. My prayer for you today is that you will never have to answer those questions after such an event, but it's something that we need to think about now. What are your priorities? If you could go fix only two things, what would you go and fix? What are the gaps that you have in place? And are your suppliers, the people that support you, prepared? You could change that and say also, do your teachers have plans at home? Because in a disaster or a crisis, family trumps job, and so they're going to be concerned about their family first before they think about their job at the school. So if you want to talk about why measure, you've got to think about it like a map. You've got to figure out, where are we now? Where are we going? How long is it going to take? What's the best route for us to implement, to carry forward within that? And then how do we measure our progress? Are we 10% of the way there? Are we 50% of the way there? And how critical are those gaps and what they mean to us? At the end, we'll talk about an outside assessment that you can do, but you can begin these questions today inside your school and focusing in each of these areas. So what should you measure? The first thing is you've got to understand what the goals are that you have in place. Have you articulated, has your board, has your head of school, your leadership articulated what the goals are? And the safety of our children is clearly going to be paramount in everything that we focus on. We recently worked with a business, and they were getting ready to do some environmental health and safety training and OSHA training, and they wanted us to conduct the training for them, which is not atypical with the types of areas that we're involved with. But the key on training is you train to the exact plan that you have in place. You don't train to something that your documentation doesn't support. So look at the documentation of your plan. If you had to train from that, is it sufficient? So how do you demonstrate the preparedness within your school? Now, you obviously demonstrate fire preparedness by doing fire drills, and you do that on a regular basis. You may also do an active shooter or an armed intruder training in a test to go through. I would also suggest that you should take some key leaders within your school and do a tabletop and talk about various scenarios that are coming into play so that you'd have the opportunity to understand what would happen. And that will help clarify, are there clear roles and responsibilities? And that's an issue that you need to be thinking about what you should measure associated with it. Are you aligned to best practices, and are you sure? And how do you know? if you haven't done that effort, if you haven't said, here's the best practice, here's the standard by which our plan should be measured, and let's look and see specifically where we are associated with those. Some of the best practices are clear: shelter in place, lockdown, lockout, evacuate. Other practices in terms of identifying behaviors of concern maybe aren't quite as clear. Having a program around those areas, understand what they are. Now, a large failure that we find in most school plans when we sit down and work with the school to identify what needs to be done and the areas that they can improve in is that they only say what to do and they don't provide the how to do it. So when you measure your plan, here's an exercise. Take your newest teacher, hand that teacher the plan, and say, tell me how you will do this using this plan. If it's not clear to that new teacher, it's not going to be clear to everyone else. Look at your plan. Is it saying only the what's to do and not the how's? And then you can immediately begin to provide the level of specificity to address the how. That's an important element. We teach that in our classrooms. We teach people how to solve a math problem and look in those areas. Our plans for preparedness need to do exactly the same thing. Continuing on how you should measure, I would take a team of at least 3 of your staff to first read your plans. I would have them read it, and I'm old school enough to say it's great to have a digital copy, and it's the way that everyone can have it, and we can work with you to help you have that even on a smartphone that everyone's available to. But print the plans out. Tell them to take their magic marker or their highlighter or their pen and check the areas of the plan that they have some questions about or that are unclear or that are the what's and not the how's or gaps in the plan. Then sit down and have them talk with each other about the documents. The key here is that makes the plan not one person's plan in your school, but it really makes it a unified approach in how you carry forward. Secondly, I would encourage you to conduct interviews after you've done the review. Talk with some of the department heads or individuals. Talk with people that have been in the school for a long time. Talk with those that are new to the school. I'd also interview some students, and depending upon how you fall in the K through 12 breakdown, I would pick a couple of the group areas and identify, here's the level that I want to talk with, and here's the persons that can give us that opportunity. And then finally, perform a site inspection. And go through your school as if you were going there for the very first time and look at the controls and look at the gaps that are in place there. And we'll give you some insights on the site inspection portion in just a few minutes. The questions that you can then start to focus on with this new 3-person committee, by the way, I wouldn't make it more than 5. We don't want this to become laborious and we don't want it to divert, but it does need to be a group to go through. Is your plan reviewed and updated annually? That's a best practice. If you wrote your plan 7 years ago and you haven't changed it since, there's a lot of changes that have occurred in that period of time. You need to bring it into alignment. How did you identify the risk that you are faced with? Did you bring in a third party to do a security assessment, for example? How do you monitor for each threat and each risk that you previously identified? If that's not clear, if that's not a role, if that's not a responsibility, that's a specific gap in your plan. How do the students, teachers, and parents know about your plan? Do you publish it? Do you send them a link? Is it something that you share directly with them? Some of the elements of your security plan you don't want to share with everyone because we don't want to give a roadmap to someone that has ill intent to attack your school to know, but you do want to let the students and parents understand that you have these programs in place. As you break your plan down, each component of it should be tested at least annually. Now that doesn't mean we have to test every aspect of our plan every month, but If you design your exercises correctly, then you could test all of the critical elements. A quick example would be armed intruder. Generally, an armed intruder is tested to see how well you go into lockdown into your school and handle it. Well, what would happen if you had students out on the sports field and you had an armed intruder at that point? Have you tested that plan and looked through there? And we'll talk about, as you do these tests, the fact that you need to do a hot wash afterwards. A hot wash is a term used for an after-action review. What worked well? What didn't work well? What do we need to do next? And then where do we go back and update our plan as we come together? So this team of 3 then becomes your internal audit department as far as we think about your planning for school preparedness and safety. You want to do this before you run out of fuel associated with the planning. Now, the site assessment, there's a lot to think about as you go around and do the walkthrough. And you'll look at all of the types of areas that you would want to go. The building security, access control, building exteriors, the key systems, the monitoring, sight lines. Do you have video cameras there? Are they recorded? Are they accessible only on site, or is there internet access to be able to view through them? Are they maintained? Are they all functional as you go forward? How do we communicate? What happens if there is no electricity? Do we have an alternative system associated with it? And then, as you all know on the call today, that the best practices are that classroom doors are locked while the classes are in session. We're trying to create barriers because in a crisis, time and access are the key elements for us. And so anything that can buy time and for help to arrive is something that we want to carry forward and look. You can see the items listed here. Some of these areas are not only physically looked at as you do the walk around, but when you look at the in the second column, the security policies and procedures, a whole listing of things that you want to make sure that you have in place, and those would be, again, some topics that you can conduct on the interviews that you will be holding on your school. As we go through, access is going to be a very specific issue as you do this walkthrough. I also encourage you to do this site assessment on your school during the day, in the daylight hours when you can see everything, and in the evening. At nighttime, it changes visibility factors, the lighting, and as you know, with all of our after-school programs and athletics, we have people on our campus throughout the day and into the evening. It would also be good to do a swing by and look at the school on the weekend and see if any of that is being used by those in the community and other access issues that can be controlled. So the site assessment is a critical element of providing you this analysis of your school and the way it's laid out. So what do we measure against? Your program framework. Is there an overarching framework that establishes this is our structure? We recommend and to align that there's an administrator on duty strategy, an AOD, an administrator on duty, so that at any point there's a standard cell phone number, there's a standard access, that if you call that, you're getting the administrator on duty to carry it forward. The framework would also identify who the crisis management team is, how those decisions would be made in a crisis and directed and coming together. So the framework is the overarching document that ties all of your planning together for your school. The risk assessment, you want to assess that to make sure that those elements are done. As you do the interviews, I would be asking people, what keeps you up tonight at night? What are you concerned about? And as you look forward. Also, continue to monitor what's going on in other schools and other areas. We regularly see opportunities for improvement within schools because we learn from the trials that other schools face, the other exposures that are there. we responded just recently to help a school in crisis, and the school is a Montessori school. And in looking at it, they cover through preschool all the way up into the elementary ages, and they had a parent who was upset because this 3-year-old daughter had explained that she had been touched inappropriately by a 5-year-old student in the school. And the parent's reaction to this was obviously ballistic and attacking the school for lack of supervision, and carried and filed a police complaint and a licensing complaint, took the child down for a rape test at the hospital, and the escalation of the events suddenly cascaded immediately from there. So thinking about what the risks are that could happen, how do we deal with that? How do we monitor the children on the playground? Is there video surveillance just to have documentation as we come in? They have a great program in place with the school with numbers of teachers outside to view this and carry forward. Fortunately, all of the investigation and the other information came out positively for the school, but how would you handle that if those allegations came and directed back to you? School and workplace violence, we've talked about this in numerous webinars. You need to have a behavior of concern program. How do you identify behaviors of concern? How do you handle the individuals once those behaviors have been put in place? That's the Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment Program, and the documentation and maining through that, the interviews, the investigations. It has to be a formal program in every school today to make sure that your plan's alive. And intelligence monitoring. We've talked about that today. When people know, 80% of the time, if someone has ill intent toward your school that is threatening, 80% of the time someone else knows, at least one person. 67% of the time, 2 or more people know. And we're in a world today that when people know, they talk, and where do they talk? On social media. If you do not have an intelligence monitoring program with technology tools to be able to predict what's going to happen next, because what's on social media today will be in your school tomorrow. This is a critical aspect for you to be concerned about within your school. So that's another, how do you know those things? Whose responsibility is it? What tools do you have in place? And this is much more than a Google search. How do you address security and evaluate your security from that standpoint? Most of us don't have armed security in our schools, but what is our security approach as we go through it? Human resources comes back and starts to begin to open up questions around background checks. We see failures in those particular areas where there's a national felony background search done, which is great, and we certainly would encourage you to do that. But you also need to do a search at the courthouse level for misdemeanors. If an individual had been charged with a felony but plea bargained it down to a misdemeanor, they won't appear in the national database. So that opens the door for you to have a problem within your school that you could have known about had you looked. It's another part of that intelligence network aspect. The other best practice to test yourself against here is that background checks need to be done annually. It's just not when you hire. It's an ongoing process. Emergency response. Now, of all of the areas when we look at schools that we generally find a strength, it's an emergency response. That's been thought through. You've got that better documented. But it's the other elements where this starts to break down and carry through in each one of the areas. And how that's communicated, how do people know, and where is the documentation that's available for it? I want to go back to human resources and talk about one other practice. One of the things that we've seen, and we've seen it unfortunately repeated, is the termination process. When you're terminating a teacher or someone else on your staff, you need to have a defined process to handle that, because it's at that moment where that can escalate from being a normal exit to being one where there's a problem that's associated. Notification, and there are multiple notification systems out there in place, but notification, in addition to sending out cell calls or text messages or emails, is the notification on campus with very clear instructions and defining those messages in advance. And also in the case of loss of power, where your PA system may not be working or your bell system might be out, still the bullhorns that are charged and immediately you can pick up and communicate and get your message out quickly. And last, the crisis communications. What are your message maps, your 3 critical messages for each one of the risks and threats that you face, for each stakeholder group? What are we telling parents? What are we telling students? What are we telling our staff, our teachers, our faculty here in light of those? What are our home bases? Now, as we all know, we cannot talk about specifics regarding a child with anyone else other than the parents. So after an event has occurred, you will hear questions being asked. Think about the school example that I gave you earlier. What could they say in those particular situations in carrying it forward? So this is what you measure against. As we go through, let's talk about what that measurement process is. As you've identified each one of these areas, I want the team of 3 that we discussed to go through and look at each component and evaluate it objectively for its completeness as compared to these best practices, and assigning a rating associated with it. And this is a process that you can do. If you prefer to have somebody from the outside do that, this is a process that we can do for you, but we're trying to empower you through this Crisis Coach webinar series with taking the steps that you need to go through. Firestorm's also available to help you as you go through. Now, we would then evaluate these with either indicating that the component is documented, and that's really good, or it's incomplete, we should add a couple of things to it. It's undocumented, or it's wrong and we need to revise it, or it just doesn't apply to us within our school and what we do. Now let's break those down a little bit more. And what we're trying to fix and go through and establish in your mind today is this is not a check-the-box approach. We want to be able to give you as much specifics as possible. So document it. The components of the plans receiving this ratings are written in alignment with best practices. The procedures are actionable. Now, actionable means it's not the what, it says how you do this. And so that's why we want 3 of you to say, yeah, if reading that, I know exactly how to do that. The content is comprehensive and provides the stakeholders. Stakeholders could be the students, the teachers, the administration, the parents, with a clear understanding of their roles and responsibilities within the plan. Plans are actionable and follow best practices. Firestorm experience has been that standard response protocol means best practices for an all-hazard emergency response program. And that's breaking down just the emergency response. But you don't look just at that. You would have to look at the behaviors of concern. You have to look at the hiring process and how you handle each one of these, the way the administrator on duty, the way the decisions are made in the crisis by the management team. Is there a set of checklists? Is there a unique process that's followed each and every time? Because that's where the criticality starts to come in. The standard response protocol is based upon in each individual scenarios, and it can follow the incident command structure, but sometimes we've seen that listed and it's not part of your culture associated with it. And if you look through in that distinction, if you want more detail around it, you can go to the iloveyoguys.org, and it's listed there, and I think that it's now used in much more than 5,000. That was the last time I looked at. I haven't updated the slide. So as you look through, using standard terms, lockout, lockdown, evacuate, shelter, those are terms that people understand. If you start saying this is a code green or a code red, somebody's got to figure out. We've also seen people try to use the mascot name to link it with something else. You want clarity here, and as you establish this response protocol, one of the elements in making sure that your plans align are you talking with your local first responders, and do they understand your terminology, and do they understand where to go on your campus? I've had the pleasure of visiting a great many of the independent schools in the state of Georgia and looking at their locations and walking through, and there's a lot of buildings in a lot of your schools. And where do the police need to go if it's a problem in the cafeteria? Do they know where the cafeteria is? Do they know what's the fastest way to get to that particular point? Because when seconds really matter, the police will be there in minutes, and it's a critical area to think through. The other components that we listed were incomplete, undocumented, and revised. It means that there's some detail that we need to have. That's great. Now we've identified it. We can begin to work on it, and you can bring your plans more into alignment with standards and best practices. You really are functioning here in an internal audit manner to make it faster, easier to execute in the case of responsibility. If it's undocumented, it's not going to happen. If it's undocumented, it's not going to happen. If you can't find it written down, if it's not been trained, if it's not a part of who your school here is, that's a significant gap. Now, one of the things that Firestorm has learned from all the consequence management that we do, and I want to explain that just for a second, the crisis is going to be very short-lived. The crisis happens, it's over with, but the consequences last for years as a result of that. That's a key area for you to focus on and to think about is in those particular areas. But as a rule, if you're explaining, you're losing. Well, you know, we didn't really have that in our plan. Well, why didn't you have it in your plan? Why don't your plans align to standards and best practices? And if you're asked the question, do your plans align to standards and best practices, and you haven't looked, how can you answer that yes? You can't. If you answer it yes, and later there's a problem in your school, and it becomes clear that it doesn't, now you've lost credibility. Now you have a significant problem within your school that you need to address and to carry forward. So this area becomes very important, whether it's documented, incomplete, or undocumented. Now, some of the things you're going to read in your plan are just wrong. We need to revise it. It's incorrect. It's inconsistent with best practices. We need to focus here to start to make a difference with who we are. And we've got to change because now we're on this that we have a specific problem. This is where your team of 3 will certainly play a critical role. Now, after an event could be a test exercise. That could be a tabletop. It could be a walkthrough. It could be a simulation that you do. It could be a drill. You want to see how did we do? Or it could be an actual event. We found that there was an episode of bullying going on one of our teams. Okay, how did you respond to that? How did you learn about it? What steps did you take? What was the discipline steps that you put into play? How do those elements start to come together associated with each one of those? Conducting that wash will identify what went well, what didn't go well, and what are the lessons learned. And every time you do a hot wash, you would then go back, review your plans, thinking about the documented, the undocumented, the revised, those elements to be able to come back and say, this is where we need to improve our plan. When we think about preparedness, when we think about safety in all of these areas, this is a continuous improvement process. It's not a single day. We don't have a plan, put it on the shelf, and it's done. We've got an ongoing process that needs to be addressed in each one of those areas as we're going through. So the hot wash, here's you a list of activities that you would carry forward. By the way, I think the team that should lead the hot wash might well be those same 3 that did the analysis, that did the internal review of your plan. Review and evaluate the event. Obtain feedback from everybody that was there. Ask the teachers. Ask some of your student leaders what they saw. Note if there were any issues of command, control, coordination, and communications. Those 4 C's start to lead to grades that are a little bit lower than a C if they're not in place. Have each function or business unit or departmental chair report on their experiences. Prioritize the lessons learned. Look at what the cost accounting is. In some of these cases, you're ending up buying things at the last minute. That could be an excessive expense to carry it forward. Take pictures. If you're doing an exercise or an event, take pictures of it as it carries forward. If it's an actual crisis that's occurring, those pictures will be useful for your internal investigation as you're pulling those elements together. Look back at this event in light of your current plans. Identify, we really need to train over here a little bit more. We need to test over there as you would put those elements together, and then create a document. If you had an event that occurred, in all likelihood, you want to be able to share how the school did in that event with your board. The board has an oversight responsibility here to make sure that all of these elements are coming into play. So if you wanted to summarize everything we've talked about so far, you'd look at predict, plan, perform. Do you understand all of the vulnerabilities and threats? Do you understand their impacts? Do you understand how they're going to be monitored and what the triggers are for action? Have you assigned the responsibilities for people to do that? Do they have the tools in place to be done? The plans, do you have a communicable illness plan? Do you have a workplace violence? Do you have a behaviors of concern? Do you have a crisis management plan? Is there an overarching framework? Do you have all of those elements in place? And then perform. Have you trained everyone? Have you tested it? Do you have the emergency supplies in place to execute that? Do you do the continuous monitoring that needs to be done? And do you have the crisis management structure? So you've got to look at everything. You've got to look at what's there and what's not there. That's the reason that internal audit exists within an organization. That's the reason why you need to have this together, and why you listen to this webinar today to think about each of these areas. The intelligence network is important because it will tell you what's going to happen within your school, and it will give you an indication if your message is coming out or if there's indicators of problems that are there. The first is listening, which gives you situational awareness, and that picks up words and phrases and streams that become important to know about it. Looking is where you're then, once you've gotten something that's of concern, we start to look at that person of interest. We look at their sphere of influence in talking. We've shared with you in other webinars the ability to find that someone's brought a gun to school, or someone's having suicidal thoughts, or someone feels that they're not respected or valued within the school. Understanding that, you have the capabilities to address it. If you don't know that it's going on, those capabilities are wasted. That's an opportunity lost that can never be regained, and unfortunately may trigger the type of a crisis that we see all too often in our schools as those elements come together. So, do you really want to know what will happen tomorrow? Yeah, I think we do. I think we must know that in our schools. And could you afford not to know? If you knew there was a significant problem in your school, you would go fix it. If you knew there was a plumbing problem with the boys' bathroom, you would go and fix the plumbing problem in those areas. If we're concerned about something as mundane as plumbing, why wouldn't we be concerned about the safety of our students at the same level? And so those indicators become extremely critical to carry forward. Do you know where your plan is relative to standards and best practices? Have you spent time taking a deep look to see, is it documented? Is it incomplete? Is it undocumented? Or is it wrong and it needs to be revised? It's not a box that you can check and say, we got a plan and it's on the shelf. What you need to do is have a plan that everybody knows and that works for you at that point when you need it. If you want to summarize the use of a plan, it's time and access. The plan gets you the best response in the shortest period of time, or it can also buy you time until help can arrive. That's an extremely important aspect associated with it. And access, it controls access to the school, it provides access to the information that people need. So time and access, if you really want to summarize it down to the smallest elements, are what we're going to be focused on. But if it's not documented, if it's not trained, if it's not tested, you don't have a plan. If you've got a plan and it's 5 years old, you don't have a plan. If you've got a plan and it's never tested, you don't have a plan. And if you think about the questions that are asked, how do you know? And are you sure? So if I were to ask you today, are you ready? How do you know? And are you sure? And if you can't say 100% that you're sure, if you can't say how you know that, you're not ready. And that's really where today's webinar is focused. It's focused on sharing with you those types of concerns to think about as we go through. If you would like some help in this area, you can reach out. We can help you align your plans to best practices. We can help you create your own intelligence network or schedule crisis coach training associated with that. And we're going to try to reach out to everyone on today's webinar to see how we can be of help. Also, the Georgia Independent School Association has underwritten the cost of a self-assessment. It's a facilitated assessment where you look at some 45 different data points that's required to be sure that your plans align to best practices. And there is no cost to your school because the cost has been underwritten by the Georgia Independent School Association in doing those things, to provide that information to you. We look forward to continuing this series as we continue to try to go in-depth each month on a particular topic. If you've got questions, you can reach us at firestorm.com, or you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or call us at 800-321-2219. Our time today doesn't allow us to take questions. I see that a couple have come in. So we're going to try to reach out again, as I said, either Chad White or Hutch Hodson will be calling you to answer questions. But if you don't get that call quickly enough, pick up the phone and just give us a call, and we'll facilitate that in coming together. I want to thank you for what you're doing in the schools every day. Your role as a leader in the school, your role as a teacher, department head, staff, it's a mission, just like any other mission that's out there. Thank you for taking the time and to work with the children and the young people. I think as we close today, our prayer is that you never have to implement your plan fully in the event of a lot of these types of things. Unfortunately, our phone rings many times every week with a school in crisis. Every day there's a school in crisis in America. That's where we are today. The threats are there. Whether it's the attacks that we saw in Africa by the terrorist group, the threats have been made against schools in America by Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others. And all it takes is one person to make a difference in terms of attack on a school. It's the fear that every parent has. You have care, custody, and control of their child during the day. They want their child returned to them in the same condition that they shared them with you. Thank you for everything you do to make sure that that happens. Have a great day. Have a wonderful spring. And as Bill said at the very beginning, we've got hot weather back in Atlanta, and I think we can maybe put up our sweaters for here for a while. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll be reaching out to you in the coming week. Good day.